Ladies and gentlemen, this RedGamerTech.com video, we're going to be continuing our discussion of the Xbox One GPU versus the PS4 GPU. This is part 7. I can only hope you've stuck with us so far. In this one, we're going to be discussing a little bit about DirectX 11.2 and some of its particular features, and we're also going to be hopefully finishing off the series with my final thoughts and conclusions. So DirectX 11.2 is being implemented in Windows 8.1. It's basically exclusive for Windows 8, and of course 8.1 is a free upgrade, just in case you're curious. Xbox One uses a derivative of the DirectX 11.2 API. They're basically using it as a baseline and then stripping away things that are superfluous to Xbox One, in other words, aren't really required. This is obviously an attempt to reduce the memory footprint and also get more processing power back. One of the key features that Microsoft are touting for 11.2 is what is known as tiled resources. Now, tiled resources, and I'm going to really simplify this stuff for the purposes of time. I have actually done another video on tiled resources, so you can check that out if you so wish. But the primary purpose of tiled resources is so that you can have a rather consistent level of texture quality. One of the problems with games now and textures as a whole is that they become extremely expensive in memory. And so when you're playing a game, you have to have this ridiculously persistent level of textures around you, and that's not sometimes cheap in terms of memory, and sometimes not very good for overall performance, because let's face it, if you are not looking at something, let's say something is obscured from view or really far away, having high resolution textures there isn't necessarily what you require or need. And so the basic purpose is as you get closer to the image, the texture will basically continue to improve in quality. Now, it is worth noting that mega texturing and sparse textures, which are from OpenGL, are pretty similar in terms of what they could do, and they are going to be implemented further. Now, OpenGL, of course, is very important for PlayStation 4 owners. There have been numerous other changes as well in 11.2, including various changes to HLSL, which is High Level Shader Language, and which is used for Microsoft DirectX 11. These allow much better linking and functionality, and a lot of this, of course, is going towards the route of GPU. It's worth noting, just in case you're a bit curious, HLSL is also very similar to the OpenGL version, which is OpenGL, which is Open Graphics Library. OpenGL, by the way, also known as GLSL for its own shader language, is very similar to HLSL. HLSL, by the way, also uses a language and structure very similar to that of C or C++. So obviously there are a lot of similarities there. It also has some similarities to C# as well as Java. HLSL shader linking will allow the programmers, graphics programmers, to actually create pre-compiled HLSL functions, and then they can package them all together in libraries. And this, of course, is very good. As I said, a lot of this is really heading towards a GPU functionality, at least in my opinion. Now, it's most likely that when we're talking about tiled resources, it's really going to come into its own on, well, the Xbox One, mostly because of the ESRAM, and the purpose of being able to swap large amounts of data very seamlessly is definitely going to help in the Xbox One, simply because there are finite resources. Once again, it's not like the PlayStation 4 can't do this stuff, it will be doing it in a very different way, but just how each console has certain specifications that are its strength, and certain aspects which aren't that important, I have a feeling that the Xbox One is really going to rely heavily on tiled resources in the future for future games, because obviously the ability to quickly swap huge amounts of textures, pertinent textures, important textures, into fast memory, I mean, let's face it, the ESRAM is really going to be taking a hit. And as I've said, it does have a good hit rate as well. And so hopefully it could be starting to be used for multiple things in that respect. It's worth noting that this is also Tiles Resources is very similar to Mega Textures, and John Carmack is pretty damn confident that we're actually going to be seeing that in the end, because yes, now on PC, Tiles Resources and Mega Textures, they didn't work that well for Rage, let's face it, but I think they're going to become a lot better, a lot more efficient, and a lot more powerful as time goes on, and as games developers and better APIs and so on become more experienced and just overall more proficient. And so let's talk about a few other bits and pieces, because I want to get my final thoughts and analysis and so on done in this video. It's part 7 after all, and I think one thing's really for certain: people have this preconceived notion that specifications mean everything, and yes, they do to a degree, but it's a very black and white way to look at things. And ultimately, let's say you have something that's 50% more powerful, it doesn't really mean that what games are going to look 50% better, especially since we're in this multi-production environment era right now. I also don't think we're going to have situations where, say, a Call of Duty is not going to appear on the Xbox. We are, however, going to have issues where frame rate or whatever could well be worse on the Xbox One down the road. I don't really think we're going to have these issues to begin with. One concern I do have with the Xbox One is the ES RAM. I'm very curious to know how that's going to grow over time, because it's a very static resource. Sony dismissed it for a reason. Now, maybe Microsoft do know what they're doing, and I believe they probably do. However, I think the developers themselves are going to find that ESRAM a little bit frustrating to work with, kind of like working with one hand tied behind their back in that respect. And it'll be very, very curious. I'll be very curious to see just what happens in terms of overall resolution of games, in terms of their native resolution, as well as frame rate and texture details compared to, say, the PS4. The other major concern I have with the Xbox One is the compute units. There are significantly worse compute functionality in the Xbox One compared to that of the PlayStation 4, as we went into rather heavily. I guess it depends on just how open games developers are and how much they actually feel that they do need to use compute. I don't think this is going to be an issue for, say, the next year to 2 years. The PlayStation 4, of course, does have some issues of its own. No system is completely perfect, but to be fair to Sony, they have seemed to find a fair balance between the system. I think the one concern that I do have for the PlayStation is how well will developers really utilize the compute units and some of its specific structure. I do kind of wonder as well just how much better games are going to end up being on the PlayStation 4, how well they're going to be optimized graphically compared to the Xbox, because obviously there is that concern that all we're going to be seeing is slightly better looking games or very slightly smoother looking games on the PlayStation. That's not necessarily a bad thing, I suppose. I mean, if you were to look at the Xbox 360 versus PlayStation 3, it had a history where the 360 games typically, and I use the word typically because certainly not always, but typically did perform a little bit better than that of the PlayStation 3. This is particularly true with certain fighting games. Street Fighter 4 and Marvel vs. Capcom 3 are notorious examples where there were latency involved on the screen, and there's always kind of an issue with gamers, especially in the fighter game scene, particularly when tournament money was involved, of which version are we playing, because the timings were slightly different, and that's just how things worked, I'm afraid. I don't necessarily know if that's going to translate to the Xbox 360/PS4, but I certainly wouldn't be surprised in the long run. There are multiple other issues that I'm somewhat concerned with on both systems. Microsoft, of course, are really putting a lot of stock in the cloud. Now, definitely in certain games, being able to offload AI, for example, could really be a benefit, especially in racing games. Developers have said, well, if we can turn 10, for example, turn 10 said, well, if we can get 10 to 20% back, resources back, then that's a benefit. That's a huge saving. When you consider 20% of resources is a lot, you're getting like a fifth of the power back of the console just being able to do this. And yes, it's not groundbreaking. And yes, if you were to still do this, technically speaking, the PS4, in terms of raw GPU power, and this is not really how you're supposed to calculate this, and it doesn't really make sense, but I'll just use it anyway. Then the PS4 is still 20% ahead, well, just over 20% ahead. Of course, that's not quite how AI and compute works, but you get the idea. I'm just using it as a number, which kind of is easy to calculate. It's still ahead, but let's face it, Microsoft are really betting on the cloud very heavily. Developers are still between really sold on it and loving it, such as Turn 10, and meh. They're not impressed at all. And I'm kind of in between. I defend some aspects of the cloud. I do like the persistent worlds of it and whatever else. But Mark Cerny himself has said that the PlayStation 4 does have the ability to do this cloud rendering. Should they wish, that it does. They've already spoken about this in obviously internally, Sony would have exhausted this, particularly when they started to hear of Microsoft's success, but they just are not that convinced on the graphical capability rendering of the cloud, and there are issues with it, particularly on issues as we've spoken about in previous videos where you have to sync to a frame, and this is another concern I have with AI as well. However, persistent game worlds and background rendering, weather effects, who knows just how excellent or bad that could end up being. Sony definitely went to town with the APU in the PlayStation 4. That combined with the GDDR5 RAM are certainly a simpler, smarter way of doing things on the surface, but one can argue that their approach was really simple. They took the KISS approach in that respect, and many people really applaud them for that. And I actually admit that it's a very simple, elegant solution. They went with a solution that's pretty damn easy to figure out. I mean, it's unified architecture. And ultimately, a lot of this is also going to depend on how easy it is for the developers to actually tap into a feature. Right now, of course, Sony are working their butt off to try and work with developers, to try and get those developers as much potential power as possible and as easy as possible. And of course, there are two ways they can do this. They can either code low level, which is pretty much full access to the hardware, or they can do it high level. Now, there have been improvements to DirectX and the APIs on the Xbox One, allowing them to go in basically deeper into the API, certainly code lower level, but we'll have to see which one developers end up preferring. And of course, right now there are still a hell of a lot of NDAs in place. I mean, there probably will be NDAs in place for the next 6 months after the console's launch, let alone right now. You can even tell that John Carmack wanted to say a few bits and pieces when he was on giving his keynotes, when he was giving his speeches in QuakeCon, but obviously he couldn't, which is understandable. Obviously he has confidentiality agreements in place, and that's just how things work, unfortunately, in the industry. Ultimately as well, there are definitely going to be improvements on the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One's API over a series of period of time. Both systems, of course, do have a very similar processors. In fact, pretty much identical processors, 1.6 gigahertz. So in that respect, no system, in theory at least, depending on operating system. For example, let's assume, let's just use a complete fabricated rumor. Let's just assume in 2 years' time, Microsoft managed to free up one CPU for the Xbox One. That would obviously give them a CPU bonus, which would obviously in that respect free up a little bit of extra power and of course be able to feed the GPUs a little bit more as well. But for right now, in terms of CPU processing, they're very similar. And that's going to be a key. I do wonder in that respect if the PS4 is going to be at all GPU starved, or should I say data starved from the CPU. Obviously, one of the purposes behind the extra power, of course, is simply the fact that, well, they can, in theory, render at much higher resolutions and higher frame rates, so in theory it shouldn't be too much of a big deal. Both systems have very similar amounts of memory, which isn't a particularly big deal in my opinion. I don't really think that, 5 gigabytes is a particularly small small amount of RAM, considering that right now developers are used to like 512 megabytes total. And that's pretty pitiful, to be honest with you. So obviously they're getting significantly more. We don't really know what the optimization is going to be later. One thing I do not like about the Xbox One is the fact that, yes, they have managed to upclock the GPU from 800 megahertz to 853, which is, it's not piddling. It's not a bad amount of extra power. That gives them about 1.31-ish teraflops of computing power compared to 1.24, so it's an improvement. That's good. That's definitely good. However, one concern that I have, and no doubt some developers have as well, is that, according to Microsoft anyway, in various interviews, they have said that 10% of Xbox One's GPU is going to be utilized for the UI and system and whatever else, which, when you consider, they're already dealing with a lower amount of power to begin with, that is a bit of concern. I do wonder, however, if that 10% is going to be static. I do wonder if in, say, well, now, of course, they have more GPU power to work with, so maybe it won't quite be 10%, maybe it'll be around, 8, 9%, whatever, which would definitely be not a bad number, I suppose, but still significantly less than the PlayStation 4. Then again, the Xbox One does have the Move engines, which will reduce overhead and compute time and so on, because they're basically fixed function accelerators, so they can basically process the data around even if the GPU itself is completely crammed with information and flat out, and that's definitely going to be a good thing. The other benefit, of course, from the perspective of the game's developers, is because they are fixed function, for the most part, the games developers don't really have to worry about that much. All games developers have to really do, much like PlayStation 4 in that respect, they just have to be smart with how the memory is used. It's just going to be a bit more difficult to get full graphic performance, I think, out of the Xbox One because of the ESRAM. But with that said, the Xbox One also has less GCN cores anyway. Because it has less graphical cores, it could be that the memory bandwidth isn't too much of a big deal, because obviously less GCN cores, in other words less, graphical processing power, means less memory bandwidth is required to actually feed those cores. It's a pretty simple math when you think about it. There are already rumours from developers who have been speaking out. However, of course, as per normal on this stuff, they're not giving their name. They are not saying that they work for Ubisoft and their name is, Matt Thompson or whatever. They have kept rather quiet on various forums and boards and leaks and whatever to the press. And they've remained pretty consistent and said that they believe that the Xbox One will have a disadvantage in the future. Primarily, most likely a slightly lower internal resolution, which is going to render games at. For example, it could be 1600 by 900 or 1792 or whatever. Who knows what they're going to be, eventually end up using. But obviously, eventually, even the PlayStation 4 is most likely going to have to make some compromises as well. It depends, I suppose, on how long this console generation goes for. My gut feeling, and well, you can look at history, that it's really going to last at least 5 years. With, it's going to be at least 2018 or 2017, 18 before we start hearing rumours, in my personal opinion anyway, of the next generation PlayStation. Assuming there is one. I mean, games developers, right, or should I say, people in the industry are really split of whether there's going to be another console generation or not. Personally, I think there's going to be at least one more, but who the heck knows? John Carmack doesn't really seem to think so. Other games developers do. So, well, take your pick, I suppose, on that respect. Of course, consoles are fixed in terms of specifications, are fixed in terms of their APIs, and of course, that's very good news for games developers, because that does mean that they can get the most out of the system is possible. I mean, who would have thought that, say, The Last of Us would have been possible on the PS3? I certainly wouldn't. I was even very impressed when I saw, say, Uncharted on the PS3. And Uncharted is a good-looking game, it is, but it's just nothing compared to The Last of Us when you really think about how much is going on in terms of the character animation, the physics involved, and goodness knows what else. And sure, there is the odd ropey graphic here and there, but overall they did do a very good job indeed. It's very early to say, however, just what the developers themselves, and I'm talking about Sony and Microsoft, have planned for the system. Sony seems pretty damn confident that there are extras in the system that they will unlock over time, the game's developers will unlock over time. I'm wondering if that's some kind of code to say that they are planning to, well, we do know that there's a good chance they're going to unleash more memory, but there's also a very good chance that they could upclock the GPU as well. I mean, that's just pure speculation on my part. And obviously, if they were to do 850 megahertz, just for example, as an arbitrary number, throwing that out there, it would definitely be a lot more than Xbox's 850 megahertz, simply because they do have more GCN cores to begin with, and therefore, proportionally, it's a bigger increase. Microsoft are very confident, or appear very confident. They say they're very happy with the graphics performance, and they say that developers are becoming increasingly happy with the APIs. To begin with, Microsoft were definitely behind, significantly actually behind Sony in terms of their graphics libraries, APIs, and the development overall of their console. However, things are starting to take shape now, and the Xbox is certainly becoming a lot more solid. However, you can also tell that the Xbox One, I think Microsoft probably would have changed a few things if they, actually could have if they had time. Just today, for example, we've debunked the myth that there's going to be 12 gigabytes of memory in the console. Personally, I never really expected there to be 12 gigs of memory in the Xbox One. It was an odd number for a start, considering the overall insides of the Jaguar, for example, is dual channel memory. And a lot more besides. It just didn't really make sense to me. But who knows just what else is going to be happening. The Radeon GCN architecture itself, of course, could be very easily programmed with C++, and its compute functionality heavily unlocked with C++. And both consoles in that respect really seem to be pushing together. Visual Studio, for example, various graphics libraries, all of it's tying together. And I think a lot of this stuff eventually is going to come down very, very heavily to just what the studios themselves can do. As I've said previously, John Carmack, other developers have said that, look, it's not just a case now where it used to be back in the old days where one or two developers in the studio, they would know everything, they would have a handle on everything, and everything would be, go through them, and they'd be able to handle the programming, they'd know everything about systems, and they would be like the gurus. It's not really like that anymore. Games are becoming so complicated, so convoluted in terms of their code, that code changes over time and programming techniques evolve and improve, but it takes many iterations and many frustrating bouts of bug fixing for the most part for them to improve the code to the point where things really work. And even when you've got used to the engine itself, then you could always make improvements to your own engines, to your own APIs, and things evolve. Your own understanding of things evolve, and this generation of consoles is definitely the most convoluted and complex. Both systems also have to face stiff competition. The x86-64 architecture is a blessing for PC owners because it means we're going to get much better ports and most likely much faster ports as well. This, of course, means that there's going to be a lot more competition in the marketplace for that alone. Who knows what Nintendo are going to do, whether they're going to release another console. If, of course, they do in, say, 3 years' time, then obviously, unless they really are just bad, unless they do something really, really bad, it's going to be at least as powerful as the PS4. Most likely more so. I mean, if you release a console 3 years later, 4 years later, then you expect it to be more powerful unless you're doing something really, really wrong. And so it's getting to the point now where things are definitely going to become a hell of a lot more interesting than what they used to be. Compute is definitely on the way forward, and we know that developers are barely scratching the surface of it right now. The GCN architecture that powers both the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One has been basically designed from the ground up. They got rid of ALIW, and now, of course, they've gone to a much better SIMD single instruction multi-data environment. They've got much better tools, and the tool chains are becoming a lot more powerful as well. But once again, it's a question of how long will it take for developers to really utilize the stuff. And it's definitely getting to the point where AMD themselves, they really want to make PC and PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, in other words, porting, they want to make it a lot more smoother, and that's one of the reasons that they're actually releasing the PS4 chipset, basically, or a variant of it anyway, to desktop owners, and goodness knows what else. And it's going to be slow. I think a lot of the stuff is going to be slow, but definitely we're going to be seeing major strides in computers. But my personal predictions are that the Xbox One and PlayStation 4, we're probably not going to be seeing huge differences at the start. There might be a little bit, if the Xbox One, for example, is a bit harder to program for, there might be slight differences, but it's most likely not going to be an indication of just how much slower the GPU is. I think it's going to take a number of years, maybe 2 to 3 years, as they start maxing out the hardware and really understanding what they're doing. More to the point as well, when the Xbox 360 and PS3 are no longer limiting them. In other words, when they no longer have to produce engines and have to worry about LODs, level of details, and whatever else and worlds that are possible on the PS3. Because obviously, even if you are improving the graphics and physics and so on, if you're still developing for the lowest common denominator, in which case the PS3, then you've still got that, inherent thing holding you back, and that's definitely not a good thing in my personal opinion. So physics is definitely going to improve over a course of time, and as well as clipping, we're going to get much better clipping, ray tracing, and goodness knows what else as well. But these things are going to be slow to implement, and I think as they are going to implement, I don't necessarily know if we're going to get huge, massive improvements in graphics at the start. I think we're definitely going to get situations, however, where games development is going, developers are going to have to start making choices. Do they start using the PS4's extra GPU power to, say, just release it in 60 FPS, or are they gonna just do it in 30 FPS but do better graphics, for example? And these are all questions they have to argue and wrestle with, because the higher the FPS you're going with, the higher the resolution you're aiming for, shooting for, the less detail you can put in other things. There's always a trade-off in fixed systems, and that's just how it goes. I'm really hoping that the Xbox One does do extremely well graphically. I'm hoping that we don't get this situation where the Xbox One ports are like the really bad ports, because I don't think that's good for anyone involved. It just makes everyone a little bit lazy, and the other problem with it as well is that then it breeds this air where developers don't really feel they have to try so hard for that console, because they can just write it down to, sorry, it's the hardware, and that's it. And that's not really good. I mean, the Saturn had very similar problems. In reality, the Saturn was a really powerful machine, especially if you got to grips with it, but developers, they would say, oh, well, it's very hard to get stuff working on Saturn. And then along comes a company, development studios like AM2 or Lobotomy Software that put out ridiculously complicated games. I mean, they got Quake 1 working pretty damn fantastically on the Saturn, and indeed, the Saturn's version had really good lighting as well. No one believed that they'd be able to cram in something like, say, Duke Nukem on the Saturn, and yet it happened. And this was pretty consistent throughout the entire development process, and yes, they had to make some concessions. Yes, they had to build the engines basically from the ground up, but it did work. But that's the thing. So I guess we're going to have to see over a long period of time just what happens with both systems. Of course, on this channel we will be doing graphical analysis of both systems, particularly cross-platform games. I think that we're going to be doing them Xbox One, PS4 and PC, just using the PC like highest resolution textures and blah 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 as like a benchmark to see how the two systems both deal with the rivalry. And it's not really to say, oh, the PS4 is better or the Xbox One or the PC or whatever is better. It's just to see what the different approaches is, particularly on the Xbox One and PS4. I'm very, very curious on which approach actually ends up being better and how much further behind the Xbox One is, because there's this like thing right now on the internet where, you know, I kind of feel bad for the Xbox, because anyone would think that it's like, you know, the original Wii versus like, you know, the Xbox 360, or the original Wii versus, I don't know, like a high-end gaming PC or something. It's really strange. And sure, Microsoft, in my personal opinion, they did make a couple of bad choices, primarily on the DDR3, but I don't think it's going to be to the point where it hampers the console completely, and I do think that Xbox 360 is going to do really well. I do, however, believe that the Xbox 360, the Xbox One is definitely going to have to rely on developers putting in more time into it, and that does give me a little bit of concern. But who knows in the end how it's all going to end up. I guess all we can do is, well, keep checking back. Anyway, I think that's just about it on this particular video series. It's been fairly lengthy. Obviously, this one's not been really technical compared to the others anyway. It's been kind of relaxed and just my final departing thoughts, so to speak. So what have we got coming up, I hear you scream? Well, quite a hell of a lot. I'm doing some stuff in the background right now that I'm not going to bother to mention quite yet. I'm just working on it, and I'll inform you guys in a not too distant future of what I'm working on, because it's still kind of up in the air, a few bits and pieces, but it's pretty awesome nevertheless. Of course, we're going to be doing a lot of graphical analysis of whatever the Xbox One, PS4 when it's released, and frame rate and goodness knows what else. Top of that as well, I'm going to be doing a lot more in terms of APIs, graphics, CPUs, goodness knows what else. I have some series in mind, including physics. I want to be showing you guys some stuff on that. Hopefully you guys will be sticking around for me, because there's so much left to cover, and tech evolves so quickly. I don't think I can ever completely and utterly catch up with everything that's going on, but I'm going to do my bloody darndest to try. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the series. As I said, there will be a lot more in the next coming weeks. So, bye for now and take care of yourselves.